Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here, and thank you, Claude, for such an amazing introduction. I'm hoping not to have to use the microphone. Is that okay for those in the back? Are you able to hear me? Okay. If at any time I start mumbling or turning towards the wall, just flag me down and we'll fix it. Okay. Well, I'm incredibly excited to be here, and what an amazing group of people to be able to talk with. So I just think this is fabulous. So I do technology-based interventions, but that doesn't mean that I'm really good with this pointer. I will just call that out right now. It's going to be a bit of a mess, but we'll get there together, and it's going to be fabulous. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about technology-based interventions and how we go about developing them. And we have an hour and a half here, and I think that this can be a conversation as much as it is a presentation and then questions. So if at any time you want to stop and talk more about something, you think I'm sort of moving in a direction that is less useful than another direction, flag me down and we'll work it out. But a general roadmap is, first, let's talk about the why of technology. I think we're all relatively clear about it, but let's just make sure we're on the same page. And then maybe we can go quickly through that, because Claude did an amazing job of talking about the populations that we've worked with, just so that you have a sense of where I'm coming from in my lens. And then we'll talk about the recipe that we've developed over time in terms of sort of the steps that we like to go through when we're developing interventions. And if we have time, we can talk about how we got there. And then lessons learned, and what it means for future intervention development. And then questions, obviously. Okay. So the why of technology. So this is one of my favorite slides from CiPHR, which is an internet-based HIV prevention program that we developed for secondary school students, which is basically high school students in Mbarara, Uganda, which is 5 hours outside of the main capital. The capital, there is no secondary capital. So what I really like about this is that it just, for me at least, just pops, right? I mean, the color is really vivid. And while we're talking about what HIV stands for, it just feels more exciting because of what's going on visually, which I think is really important, because in settings like Africa, where you have the potential to use technology to reach a ton of people, and yet the internet is really slow, you want to be sure that you're capitalizing on the benefits, like the visual impact that you can have, while not making it so painful to get through each section, because it takes 10 minutes for each page to load. So this is an example of how we used visual while making it easy to load. You don't know that, you'll just have to take my word for it, but that's what we've done. So in addition to that, I think that technology allows us to go where young people are. I mean, anybody who goes outside and interacts with kids in any way knows that the internet and text messaging is really where young people spend quite a bit of their time. And I think instead of putting a shingle out and wondering why they're not coming to us, thinking about ways that we can go to them and make it easier for them to adopt into health behavior change interventions is really the way to go. I think technology allows us to tailor the information while also maintaining fidelity. So fidelity is kind of a big deal, right? So you think about school-based interventions where you have teachers who were taught to teach. They weren't taught to talk about condoms and vaginas and penises, and so it makes sense that they may not really want to talk about that with teens, and so they might sort of decide what's more important and what's less important, and maybe not talk about the less important stuff. And so you end up with differential fidelity across, and we find out that that actually helps us understand why an intervention works and doesn't. But with technology, you don't have this person on the other end to feel uncomfortable or to in any way sort of censor information. The same information goes to the same people, but what you can do is say, okay, well, this person has never had sex, so I'm going to send the same information, but from the frame of, I know you've never had sex, so let's talk about how we can give you the skills you need for when you have sex in the future. Right? And then you have people who have had sex, and you say, you've had sex, let's talk about what that looks like, let's talk about how you can make healthy decisions in the future. So I'm talking about the same stuff, but I'm framing it in a different way that then makes the content more relevant. Technology overcomes barriers that traditional interventions struggle with in terms of scheduling, in terms of transportation. Teens especially, but adults also, are very busy. And so getting them to carve out time to come 6 times to your center to talk for an hour and a half about something that's really important is really hard. And with technology, you can go to their home, you can go to their hand, you can overcome those issues. I think it's also incredibly important to acknowledge that technology allows people to engage with health information in an anonymous way. They don't have to look at another person, they don't have to be in a group of people and worry about how their reaction is being judged by others. They can just sit there in a private space and engage with stuff that can be incredibly embarrassing for young people, or personal or sensitive, and they can deal with that on their own. And I think that then makes them more open to some difficult conversations that we need and want to have. Once the interventions are developed, certainly these interventions are much more scalable and cost-effective than traditional interventions that require somebody to sit there and talk to people. And as we just talked about, you have the potential for making it more engaging and less didactic. I think in order to take advantage of the potential benefits, we need to be really aware of what the potential disadvantages are. And I have found in my work and with others that it's really tempting to use technology for everybody and for every case. And I think that may not be particularly helpful. If the idea is to use technology to go where people are, and your target population isn't necessarily using this technology, then maybe this isn't a good fit. So one potential bar could be if you have to give your population phones so that they can access your intervention, then that's not where they are. So just thinking about why you're using technology, and maybe there's another compelling reason that overcomes that particular issue, but just being really clear beyond it sounds really cool, right? And I think you also need to think about, we need to think about the self-motivation. So you think about school-based interventions where the kids are there. They don't have to care about what you're talking about. They're sort of this captive audience, which is why school-based interventions are awesome. I can come in and talk about bullying, and you don't have to care about bullying. You just have to sit there. But if I'm going to do a text messaging-based intervention that you're going to opt into, then I need to understand why you're going to opt in or why you might not opt in, and make sure that I design for that. And I think that this is part of the reason why follow-up rates for online programs are really low, because we design programs with multiple modules because we know that you need multiple exposures in order for a behavior change to be affected. But the way people use the internet and the way that they're trying to understand and explore health issues online is not the same as this multi-module sort of experience. It's a one-shot deal. And so that's why you have really low rates. Basically, people will come the first time, but getting them to come back is incredibly difficult. So not only understanding why you're using technology, but how people use technology and how you're going to fit into the way that they use technology is incredibly important. And for us, that's why we actually have now moved pretty solidly into text messaging, because once somebody has signed up for the program, all they have to do is have the phone, right? So we're going to them. They don't have to remember to do a thing. The messages go directly to them every day. We'll actually be talking more about this later today, but I do think it's important to note that there are ethical issues that are unique to technology. So for an in-person intervention, somebody comes in, they're visibly or audibly distressed, and so you are able to then refer that person to resources. But with a technology-based intervention where you're not physically seeing somebody, how do you know? How do you identify? How do you refer? And what is your responsibility for monitoring? If it's not a mental health intervention, what is your ethical responsibility for identifying and referring youth who are potentially in crisis? And then there's also interesting issues that are coming up for interventions that are using like geolocation. And so then we have all these data about where you go and how you spend your day, and how we protect those data, how we use those data. So there's a lot of really interesting ethical issues that make this exciting, I guess, work. I think it also, you need to, while it's cost-effective over time to have technology-based interventions, it's really expensive on the front end. So for traditional in-person interventions, it's lower cost to develop it, and once you've figured out what you're going to do, then the cost is in implementing it, right, and scaling it up. Here it's the opposite. The cost is in the development. Once it's developed, it's going to cost about the same to send it to one person versus 100 people. So getting pilot data then makes it really difficult. So because people don't want to give you a ton of money before you've demonstrated it's a thing. And then I think also identifying what's a fad versus what's transcendent. So some of you are young enough, you may not know this, but before Facebook, there was MySpace. I mean, MySpace was huge for like a day, right? And And researchers were really excited about this, and people got tons of grants to develop something on MySpace, and then Facebook happened. So I think, and now Facebook is still a thing, but now there's all these other things in addition to Facebook. And so trying to understand why people are on Facebook, right? And so maybe there's something transcendent about different components of Facebook or other places and spaces that people go online that we could develop for as opposed to one particular app like Facebook. Okay, so Claude already went through this, but we've done work with youth who are 18 and younger. We've done some work with young adults, and also some work with adults who are sort of 18 to 25 band, and then also just 18 and older youth. And I'll not belabor that. We have done quite a bit of work in HIV prevention and healthy sexuality and topics related to that, and also smoking cessation, bullying prevention, and now relapse prevention for people with serious mental illness. And so the things I'll be talking today in terms of intervention development are from lessons learned across these behavioral interventions, and so ideally they're really universal. So to that end, I would say some universal do's to keep in mind when you're developing tech-based interventions. The first one is less text is more. And this is true whether or not it's a web page or a text messaging program. When we first started doing text messaging, we had to limit ourselves to 160 characters because the smartphones weren't as ubiquitous. Now you can do a whole 2 pages. But I'll tell you, it's not just teens. I mean, people get visually overwhelmed when you have a lot to say. So less is more. Keep it to 160 characters if you can. Keep it to 1 page without scrolling if it's a web page, because if you're not going to read it, right, if you were to stop reading halfway through, why would we expect a participant to stick it out? This is not new stuff, but we need to remember that just because it's technology doesn't mean all the old rules are thrown out, right? So we still can't preach and we still can't pester. All of this, gain framing and all these theories about how we develop content and how we deliver content still matter. And the technology is the delivery mechanism. I think often people think that the text messaging is what's going to change the behavior, or the app is going to change behavior. No, it's your content. It's what you're saying and how you're saying it. That's what's going to change your behavior. And so that really matters. And I think related, there's a lot of research out there, and we've heard it too, that when you're talking to teens, they don't want you to try and sound like a peer. Using text lingo is really not. I mean, it's like your mom trying to be cool, and you're like, oh my God. You don't want to be that person, and teens will call you out on that. So if there's something that you want to say and have it come from a peer, then you can say, I was talking to a teen the other day who said, and then you can use sort of peer language in that way. And so then they know that there's sort of this signaling that that's what's happening. And I will tell you that everyone loves inspirational quotes, be it a sexual minority, teen guy, or an older adult with schizophrenia. They love inspirational quotes. So, and it doesn't have to do, it can be totally random. I mean, so I'm trying to think of an example, but like, love your body. Love your body is a great one, right? Lady Gaga quotes, or one of the ones that they love in our sexual minority one is about 2 black swans, something about black swans and how a certain percentage of them are gay or same sex. Love that, right? So I mean, it's somewhat related, but it has nothing to do with healthy sexuality. It's just affirming and kind of fun to read. And so I would say always use inspirational quotes. I would also say that you should trust your target population more than experts. So as we'll be talking about, when you're developing your intervention, you want to be talking to your target population constantly throughout the development process. And as you're doing that, you may get conflicting information. So here's an example. When we were in the process of developing our content for the schizophrenia, the relapse prevention for schizophrenia, One of the messages is about getting people up and out and active, right? And so it says something about like get your hula hoop out of the garage or get on a bicycle. And it's not because we literally think that tons of people have hula hoops, but because it gets the idea across in a way that's a little bit more fun than go out and walk, right? So people with schizophrenia were like, oh yeah, that's great. And it reminded me of my childhood and lots of positive feedback. Clinicians were like, oh no. People aren't going to get this. They're too concrete, and nobody has a hula hoop anymore. So we overruled them, and we kept the message. I trust your target population, and it's okay to say no to experts. I do it all the time. I think also, so this is something that we learned with Guy to Guy, which was our first comprehensive healthy sexuality text messaging program, is that people develop a relationship with your intervention. So the way we do our interventions, we send like 5 to 10 to 15 messages a day. It's pretty intense for about 6 to 7 weeks. There's a lot happening. And we learned that people sort of put a name to that so that they sort of feel like there's somebody on the other end of the line. And so if we don't give them a name, then they assume it's the person who enrolls them on the phone. So we actually give our program a name. Our current program is named Haley, which is really funny when our participants are named Haley too. It's really confusing. But so they have a relationship. And so what we didn't realize until we actually looked at the messages, I don't know how far in, let's call it 6 months into the program, and it's rolling enrollment. So it wasn't all of our kids. But anyway, 6 months in, we look at the messages that are coming in, and it turns out that our hello message is literally, hi, we're super psyched you're here. And they would respond, hi, super psyched too. And the program didn't know what to do with it and would send an error and be like, oh, sorry, you must be trying to reach this other program functionality. And that was their first experience with the program. Thankfully, they were, oops. So we fixed that. But, just sort of ongoing reminders, we got a text message from a control participant teen. So we now obsessively monitor our intervention participants, but not the control, because the control is all one way. It's pretty didactic. And the teen reached out to research staff and said, I've been texting you for the last 2 weeks and you haven't sent me anything. Do my messages not matter? And so, and then it turned out that when we looked at her messages, she also is depressed, and there's a lot of other stuff going on. So just understanding that there's a relationship and making sure that you build in pieces to absorb isn't the right word, but to react to that, to allow for that. Yeah.
I don't know if one question's up.
Please.
Just on that. So adults, I think, get fed up of their too many messages being sent to them from a place. Whereas you're saying teens sort of like the more 15 messages a day from something is good, rather than this is too much. Or
I think we try to stay around 7 to 10. There are some days where I get really wordy, particularly how to use condoms. That's a really long day. We do find, if you ask a teen how many messages they'd want to get, they'll say like 3 to 5. But you can sort of, a day. But you can push the envelope a little bit. And I can't remember what the current data are, but it's something like the median number of text messages that youth send and receive is about 50. It might be a little bit higher. I'm trying to remember. But it's really high in general. There's just a lot of texting that's happening. And so once we convinced people that teens would be willing to receive these number of messages, then we had to convince them that our messages wouldn't get lost in the shuffle of everybody else's messages. So,
some of us aren't teens.
You'll just have to trust me on that, yeah. So I would also encourage you to do an internal test if you're doing a text messaging program. So if it's a website, everybody clicks through, and that's pretty normal and obvious. For text messaging, everybody will sort of read the content, but reading the content in Excel or in Word is very different than receiving it on your phone. For example, receiving the 5 to 10 messages a day. If you're not willing to get it, if you stop reading it, why would we expect our participants to? And I think also what it allows us to do is read the messages on your phone, because sometimes reading it on your phone is a very different experience than reading it in Word. You're like, oh, my no, not that. And so it gives you an opportunity to experience the intervention as participants will, and to improve it as a result. And also, as you're sort of testing things, you realize stuff that doesn't work, that is broken, that you wouldn't have realized otherwise before you went into field. Just, for example, this, when you respond to the program and the program gives you a wacky response, you wouldn't have known that because all this stuff there's a lot hidden in technology, right? There's all this programming that happens behind the scenes, and the only way to know sort of how it's functioning is to actually test it. And the last thing I'd like to say is use a theoretical model, right? We talked about this a little bit before in terms of message development, but in terms of how you frame your intervention, just because we're using technology doesn't mean it's the Wild West and we don't know anything and so everything goes. No, theoretical models talk about why we think people will change their behavior or not. And that will apply whether or not you're doing this in person or you're doing it over technology. So have some guidance. Okay, so after several iterations across several different projects, these are the steps that we ideally go through when we have enough funding to do it. This is our recipe. So first we do focus groups with our target population, because we want to understand the words that they use and their understanding of why they're engaging in various behaviors, how they've tried to maybe engage in healthier behaviors and why they don't always, and what their views are on the topic at hand. So for example, with HIV prevention, we want to know, how do kids make decisions about sex? When to have sex, when not to have sex, when to use condoms, not to use condoms. And also, what are the words that they're using? Because if it's text messaging, and also if it's web-based, there's a lot of text that we're going to have our participants read, and you can pull in that focus group voice and integrate it into your messaging in a way that makes it feel much more relevant and powerful. And then, of course, you have your expert content review. So it's not like this is, again, it's not atheoretical. You do talk to your target population, but you also then make sure that it's ensconced in literature and what we know we need to be talking about. Then what we do is a content advisory team. So once we have the content completely written, we'll then send it out to teens and ask them to review message by message and give us feedback, ideally each message, and understand where they get confused, what they love, which is why I know inspirational quotes are very popular, and where they think we've sort of gone off the rails. And that's incredibly helpful. If you're doing a web-based intervention, do wireframe focus groups. So wireframes are a paper-based depiction of what you expect the website to be. So before you've spent a ton of money developing it, do a wireframe, get some kids together, or adults depending on your population, and ask them what they think about what's on the page, what they think about the flow is across, and really get some feedback in terms of the usability and understandability of your intervention. And then, as we talked about, do an internal test. Go through it yourself, experience what it's like to be a participant, not just for a day, not just for a week, but the entire program length. Do it. And ask your entire team to do it, because you have, hopefully, a diverse team that is coming at this with a very different perspective, and everybody's experience is going to be very helpful. And then pilot it. Don't not pilot it, because if you don't pilot it, the first participants in your RCT are going to be an unintentional pilot, I can guarantee. Technology breaks. It breaks all the time for reasons that are largely you just can't explain it, right? Nobody knows why. Like literally something that worked in a last intervention, we haven't changed a thing in the programming, no longer works. We don't know why and we can't fix it. So pilot it, and don't just pilot the first couple weeks, because we've done that too. Pilot the entire thing, because there's probably something in week 5 that's lurking that you forgot that you want to test because you want to make sure it works before you have your RCT folks going through. So pilot the entire thing. And then do the RCT, and then talk to the folks in the RCT about what the experience was so that you can improve it hopefully for the next time around. Did you have a question?
I was going to say, is there an evaluation component to the pilot, or are you just making sure that the application works?
So evaluation in terms of, are we looking for effect size, or in terms of, yeah. So So the pilot has a smaller sample size, so we're not looking at effect, but we are looking at process. So we actually badger our pilot participants quite a bit. So in addition to having to go through the entire intervention, we actually poke them once a week with questions. And we're like, hi, how's it been? Tell us and answer all these questions. And so you can understand by week 7, they're like, oh yeah. So for the pilot, it's much more process in that way. But we do also, in addition to the intervention, we'll also pilot our assessments just to make sure that the length of the survey isn't too burdensome, the timing of everything is going to work. So we have those data, so we could, but yeah.
So after the pilot, you might go back and tweak the website or the app.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. So, if week 3 is too long, too many messages in week 3, or week 4 is redundant with week 2. So at this point, you're not going to completely rethink the entire intervention, ideally. I mean, sometimes I do that, but more often, it's tinkering just to sort of refine things.
Can I follow up on that question?
Yeah.
Do you use any of these technology implementation evaluation models like Proceed or VA? Because then that would seem like it would be the whole development phase would be part of an evaluation, which would include maybe the RCT and VA. Is that something that you have used previously?
I haven't. I've seen it, and I've collaborated with folks so I know what you're talking about. I think it does add additional structure to this, which is always helpful. Yeah. Yeah.
Can I ask a question back to the frequency of texting?
Yeah.
We've been running some focus groups with youth who told us that if we send too many, they'll just block us.
Oh, okay.
And have you ever looked at the number of texts you sent before blocks happen? And on the flip side, are there too few you could send so that they forget about you?
Yes, there are. Yeah.
Michelle, I'm not sure that people online can hear the question, so if you could just say the question, but maybe after this one we'll let you keep going, and then we can get some more questions. I'm getting texts that people can't hear the question.
Okay, good. Okay. So the question is going back to the frequency and how much is too much before they block you, because we're hearing in focus groups, or we haven't, but you all have heard in focus groups that if it's too much, they'll block you. And on the other side, if it's too little, do they forget about you? So I think a couple things. So focus groups are really good in terms of context, right? So help me understand your experience as a sexual minority guy. Help me understand, when you're in a relationship, how do you negotiate condoms, that kind of stuff. We do typically ask about program features, but I tend to sort of put less weight on their responses because it's really hard to project out and say, if I were in this, in this particular situation, this is what I'd be willing to do or not do. And that's when I find the pilot to be incredibly helpful, right? So I would say that. So if they're saying, oh my God, 10 messages a day, I mean, that might be the case, but I wouldn't rethink your entire intervention based upon what you're hearing in the focus groups. There was another, in terms of being blocked, I'm not saying it hasn't happened. I mean, because it's not obvious, like you don't get a message saying you've been blocked, right? So I can tell you that we have, right now, our dropout rate, and we have over 450 14 to 18-year-old sexual minority girls in our girl-to-girl RCT. We have less than 1 to 2% dropout rate. And usually, I have too much stuff going on. We do sometimes hear that there's too many messages. One girl said that we were promoting sex and condoms. We're like, oh, because she had never had sex. So I would say that when it's an issue, it's not common. I do think what's important, in addition to the number of messages, is again what you're saying, right? So if you're saying the same thing in the same way over and over and over, well, then 3 messages a day is going to be too much. So again, I think that the tone and the content are really what's going to carry the day. If what you're saying is really salient and interesting and new, that teens don't have access to anywhere else, and is really important to them, they'll let you poke them 5 to 7 to 10 times a day. But if it's about bullying, I mean, we did a middle school intervention about bullying, and part of it is middle school. I think they text less, but part of it is the content. They were like, wow, 3 messages is way too much. So it depends.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. Do I need to move on? I should be paying attention to the time.
More question,
Okay.
that's fine.
You had, yeah.
So I was just wondering, you mentioned theoretical models before, and many of us are familiar with theoretical models in health communication and in changing health behavior. But I'm wondering if when it comes to sort of communication using social media, if there are other theories that are being developed or that are useful to you that might be good to for us to think about in health or in doing this.
Okay, so the question is whether or not there are theories that are particularly relevant for social media and other technology-based interventions that could help, that are sort of emerging, that could help us think about how we want to develop content.
There may not be.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say 2 things. I'm not aware of any, but that doesn't mean they don't exist, because I'm not a big theory person. And I blame it on public health, but people in public health have, I mean, they use theories, but it's, yeah, so use a theoretical model. Just, I don't know what they are. No, I mean, I think it would be interesting, because I really do think that whatever is emerging for social media, I think what you'll find is, and the same is true for theoretical models, right? Like new models, you're like, oh, well, that's basically just this old model with a new name, right? So there's a lot that's sort of supposed to be new and shiny, but is really just a repositioning of what we've been saying all along. And so I would think that if there are emerging models for social media, that it would be similar, because again, it's not that different. It is, but it isn't, which is not helpful. But okay. Ooh. All right. Well, that was unexciting. I like the picture. That's why I wanted to come back. So let me show you what this looks like in an actual program development. So this is guy to guy, and if we have time, we can talk about other program developments. But this will give you sort of a sense of what it looks like step by step. So this is a text messaging-based healthy sexuality and HIV prevention program that we developed for sexual minority teen guys, 14 to 18 years of age. It was about 6 modules. I think in the end, I probably got wordy, which is what I tend to do, so it was probably 7 weeks. Based on the information, motivation, behavioral model of HIV prevention, we recruited and randomized 302 guys. We did balance on sexual identity, so gay and then bisexual, and I can't remember, I think we put queer with bisexual. So we balanced to make sure that the arms were equal, and we also balanced on sexual experience. So unlike many HIV prevention programs for sexual minority guys, we didn't just go for those who are high risk. We went for a universal intervention, and we think that's incredibly important, especially for this age group, 14 to 18. Not everybody's having sex, but eventually, hopefully, they'll be in a healthy relationship and want to be sexually active, and so we want to be sure that we're giving them the skills that they need before they find themselves in that space. And then we had a bunch of targets in terms of age and sexual experience to make sure that we had a diverse sample. We had a control group that was blinded and attention matched. We talked about self-esteem and a little bit about bullying and a little bit about violence and substance use. So we call it healthy lifestyle. And so they got about the same number of messages and did some quotes. And so we wanted to make sure they were blinded, which they were. And, but at the same time, deliver messages that we wouldn't think are actually going to impact behavior.
So what's attention match?
Attention match, so that they're receiving the same number of messages, so they're getting the same amount of attention from the program. Although one reviewer pointed out, and this person is absolutely accurate, so in our intervention arm, we have a couple of features. One is called Text Buddy, where we match, it's a dyadic, it's a pair, so 2 intervention teens are paired together and they text to each other through the program. So we're not sharing contact information, but they text the buddy line basically, and our software then routes them to the buddy, and so they're able to talk about the program and their lives and everything. The control group doesn't have that. And then we also have, it's called leveling up, which is we're trying to take on sort of game-like features, but really it's just a quiz at the end of the week to make sure that you're paying attention, and also that you haven't blocked us, right? So are you still there? And the control group doesn't have that. And then the last one is, we called it G2 Genie, which is really just sort of on-demand tips about dating and relationships and condoms and stuff. And the Text Buddy and on-demand advice is actually old school from Anthony Rogers and his team at the University of Auckland when they developed a smoking cessation program over a decade ago. So we were not cool enough to think about that ourselves. But so the attention match is really in the number of messages rather than all of the features. And then as I mentioned earlier in terms of tailoring, we did tailor our content based upon sexual experience so that we talked about the same types of topics but framed in a different way based upon whether or not you've ever had sex or not. So this is not surprising, but again, we were talking before about how when you decide you want to use technology, you need to be able to answer the why. Why are we using text messaging for this particular population? Well, teens send and receive an average of 30 text messages per day. So I was wrong. So 30 instead of 50. Although this is 2010, I think there might be a newer one. Anyways, they text a lot. And the good news is that cell phone ownership is high across racial and ethnic groups as well as income levels. So there's this concern about digital divide, which is well taken and very important. Interestingly, we don't see this massive divide that we saw with internet access. It's narrower with cell phone ownership, and what's really interesting and intriguing is that with smartphones, the smartphones seem to be reducing the digital divide, so that there's a lot of people, for example, Black young people and adults are more likely to use their phone to access health information than a traditional sort of laptop. So really interesting, fun things that are happening with smartphones. And then there's research that suggests that we can actually affect behavior using text messaging, right? Because that was a question for a while. Messages are so brief. What are you actually going to be able to affect? So now that we've answered the why, we did some focus groups. And we did, I don't know, I should be able to, off my top of my head, I want to call it 6 focus groups. We do them online. So one of the things that I feel really strongly about is one of the benefits, one of the incredible, powerful things about technology is that you can reach people anywhere. And so in that case, why don't we develop our interventions with people everywhere? So then I have an intervention that has voice from kids all across the country as opposed to kids from all across Manhattan. And so to do that, we do focus groups online. So we recruit on Facebook, and then it's a 3-day experience. It's a bulletin board style group. So we'll post questions, and then the kids will come and they'll answer the questions, and then they can talk to each other if they want, talk to the moderator if they want. The moderator, it's run like a traditional focus group in that way, but it's all online, and we post a set of questions in the morning, and then another set in the afternoon. And so overall, you end up with a ton of data, because teens like to talk about a lot of stuff, and also because you're able to have more people in your focus group. So instead of 6 to 8 folks, we'll have 18 to 22. So we've done 6 groups of about 18 to 20 teens. So we've talked to a lot of sexual minority teen guys just in this formative piece, right? And then because it's literally they've typed it in, then I have voice that not only am I trying to affect, but I can literally copy and paste it into a message and massage it to make it flow within the intervention. So I'm a fan, obviously, of online focus groups. So what we learned was how and why. That's right, and you don't have to transcribe, which for those of us who have transcribed in-person focus groups, big fan of that as well. Yeah.
How are you sure that they meet your eligibility criteria?
So the question is, how do we make sure that they meet our eligibility criteria? We do a phone call with them, and we have found that is incredibly helpful. I think that we lose some teens because for teens, a telephone conversation is pretty intimate. They don't really want to talk to people they don't know. So we say, look, we totally understand and respect that, but if we can't talk to you, then we can't enroll you. And so when we enroll them, then we go through so when we advertise on Facebook. We push them to a screener where they have to answer all the eligibility criteria. And then that information comes to the research team, who then sends them a text and sets up an enrollment call. And then we go through all of that criteria again. And if for whatever reason it doesn't match, we ask. And I mean, you know, usually they said they were 15, but they're actually 14 because they're turning 15 in 2 weeks, that kind of thing. Yeah. So that's a good question, because I know that deception is a big sort of concern that people are thinking about. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, so you were saying that they last 3 days. Is the moderator on call the entire time watching all the content, or do you have like multiple skills in that?
Yeah, so the question is, if it's across 3 days, does that mean that the moderator is basically on call for 3 days? The answer is yeah. It's really intense. So you can understand by focus group 6, you're just like, oh yeah, it's fine. So having teams is helpful, right? So you can have like a main moderator and then a co-moderator and then sort of switch that up. And then what's really, I think, is cool is that you can also have people lurk. So the research team can look at the group as it's happening and reach out to the moderator and say, wow, what participant A is saying is really interesting. Can you ask more about this thing? And so it can be as cooperative and involved as your team really wants to do it. But the person who's moderating, it's pretty intense. Although, to be fair, for teens especially, it tends to blow up at night. So what's really intense is that you have like your regular work day, and then you have to be on at night because these teens are you know, responding through midnight and that kind of stuff. So yeah. Yeah.
Is it like on the Facebook? I'm just imagining multiple threads being started, and so how do you, like, even if you're only asking one question, I can see it really split into a lot of different topics fairly quickly, and how do you manage that?
Yeah, so the question is, so like Facebook, quickly one thread turns into 20 threads, and how do you keep track of that? So the software program, the way the software program works keeps it sort of coherent in that way. So we will post 3 different threads, 1 question per thread. And so then teams will go in and answer that 1 question in that thread. And you know, maybe they'll talk about other stuff, but it does then, you've sort of created this structure where each thread is a question, and so it tends not to get so diffuse in that way. Yeah?
So are they just answering the question, or are they commenting on each other? And if they are, how do you manage the potential for negative responses and trolling?
Yeah, so the question is how much are they responding to the question versus each other, and if it's each other, then what happens when kids get mean? So mostly they're responding to the question. We actually try to get them to respond to each other because we want this to be more of a dynamic conversation. And so we do that by saying, you know, Bob said this thing, what does everybody else think? We have found, and it could just be the population, that kids are really nice to each other. They're really affirming. That even when, you know, there's a difference of opinion. This is online. This is with sexual minority teens, and we have found that they are just so excited to be connected to each other. I think that, you know, when we do work in large urban centers, it can be sometimes easy to forget that there's a lot of teens who live in suburban and rural areas that are really disconnected. And although Trevor Space is amazing, and everybody should be on it, I'm fascinated. I'm just amazed by how many kids don't know about these online resources, including Trevor. So we have found that these teens get in the focus group, and they are just so excited. They want to keep in touch with everybody at the end. So part of the moderator's role is to make sure that people aren't posting things that are inappropriate, and we could absolutely take that down and have a conversation. And certainly part of the assent is, you know, sort of here's our code of conduct and our expectations. But we've frankly never seen that. Like I said, even when there's a difference of opinions, it's never gotten to the point where we've had to, you know, intervene. And the same for the text buddies when they're texting each other. We monitor that really closely, and there's a lot of affirmation, a lot of support, a lot of I'm here for you, as opposed to negative stuff. Okay, I know there's a lot here. Let's do this. Let's keep going, but write down your questions, and we'll continue. And I'm psyched that this is a conversation. This is awesome. So as we talked about, we gained voice. So there was one of the teen guys talked about how the reason why he was choosing to wait was because his body was his temple. And so we made this into a message, and it says, you have made the choice to wait to have sex. So a lot of this is trying to be affirming, and that's great. Your body is a temple, and you aren't going to share it with anyone unless the guy is perfect for you. So that's an example of how we were able to take something that somebody said in a focus group and put it into a message. And then we did ask about the planned program features, and again, you want to sort of weigh what they're saying with what you've experienced in past interventions. And what was interesting to us is that they were really excited about the buddy feature, but they were also kind of creeped out by it. They were like, really, I have to talk to this person I don't know, and what if he's super creepy? What if he comes on to me? And we were like, oh, okay, so well, now we're aware that there's concerns about boundaries and weirdness, and so we can address that in the code of conduct and monitoring. So once we did the focus groups and we wrote the content, then we recruited a whole new set of teens. And in fact, as we do our intervention development, exclusion criteria as we move along is if you have taken part in a previous activity, you can't take part in this next activity. Because I want to be sure that we're talking to as many teens so that this is as generalizable as we can possibly make it. So we did content advisory teams, and I think it was about 20 teens looked at the intervention content, and we literally sent them however many messages it is, like 300 messages, and asked them to give us feedback on each one. And then we did a focus group and had them all come together and talk about their experience. Not surprisingly, the focus group isn't as productive as the earlier focus groups because they're kind of tired at this point. But their per message feedback is incredibly, incredibly helpful. And we have found that sexual minority teens especially are just so enthusiastic to be involved in research, just to be asked what they think, to be given a voice. And so they just want to be asked. So you can ask them what they think about 300 text messages, and many of them will actually do it for you. They'll let you know. One of the things that we've learned across multiple CATs and multiple projects, and this is not surprising, but it does bear noting that different teens have different lenses, different people have different lenses. And I find myself, it's really easy for me to get sucked into one person who has a really strong opinion as I'm reading. I'm like, oh my God, oh, this is a mess. Or my favorite example is in the first CAT, there was a very enthusiastic guy who was like, more emojis. And I was like, can do. And the good thing is, we did a second CAT, and of course, the teens in the second CAT were like, wow, way too many emojis. So then we scaled that back a little bit. So, so do what you can to sort of, keep perspective across lens, perspectives, and definitely do a second CAT to make sure that you sort of got it right and that you didn't go too far in one direction or another. And this is just a quote that reinforces what we were talking about earlier about tone and supportive messages. One CAT, okay, so here's the message. So it says, life is wild and wacky. Sometimes one thing leads to another, and even if you weren't planning to have sex, it happens. You got to be ready for anything, anytime. So this message is about why you have to carry condoms with you all the time, right? Because not just teens, adults are the same. Why would I carry a condom if I'm not going to have sex? Well, because you might. You might have sex, you don't know. And so a participant said, totally right, and the tone is pretty playful, not stern, which is great. The point gets across very clearly. So that's your sweet spot. That's what you're going for. Something else that was really interesting and helpful and would never have occurred to me if the teens hadn't told us about this. So again, we're recruiting a wide range of experience. Teens with various sexual experiences. So some teens have had sex once or twice. Some teens have had sex, 6 months ago they were in a relationship and then they haven't found another guy, so they're not having sex right now. And then there are guys that are, having sex today and yesterday and all those things. So there's this wide range. But what we found is that many sexually active teens felt like the way the content was written was that we were assuming that they were having sex all the time. They were just constantly doing it. And they were like, that's not our lived experience. So we tried to sort of walk back from that. And I didn't put it here, but interestingly, the sexually inexperienced teens, our first week was all about abstinence and trying to be affirming of the choices that they made. And they're like, whoa, abstinence only does not belong here. And we were like, oh, okay. So we basically took that content, we just moved the week. We moved it to like week 3. So after we talked about healthy relationships and all these other things, and they'd sort of gotten to know us, then they were ready for the affirmation. So that was helpful too. But also, and I don't think this is unique to this particular program, but sexually inexperienced teens especially had a really hard time wrapping their arms around why they needed to practice using condoms, get condoms. So another feature that I forgot about are called badges. So we have various tasks that we encourage them to achieve. And so we break down the condom task, right? So first you have to get condoms, and then you have to carry condoms, and then you have to use condoms. And so we ask everybody to get and carry condoms, whether or not you've had sex or not. And so the sexually inexperienced teens are like, why don't I have to get condoms? I'm not having sex. And so although we knew that that was going to happen, getting the feedback that they were still struggling with it helped us understand that we needed to spend more time working and addressing that even further. So here's a concrete example of how testimonials and fun facts are well received. Okay. So here's an example of how you would use a testimonial. Sorry, I thought it was feedback, which is much more interesting. But here's how we do testimonials. So instead of saying, pretending that I'm a teen, I will say, one guy asked me if I broke up a month ago, should I get tested immediately or wait until after the window period if I know I won't be having sex? So the idea is that this is a relatively mundane question that's not that interesting. We're talking about the window period, right? I mean, it's kind of boring. But hopefully, by couching it as a conversation that I've had with another teen, that might make it a little bit more interesting and exciting, or at least palatable. All right, so once you do the content advisory team and you update your entire content and then send it back to the software folks and then they integrate it, then we do the internal test. And again, the internal test is when we as researchers all go through as if we're participants. And so this is what we've talked about. But you can identify glitches that you would not have anticipated, and also the participants might not be able to identify. So, I mean, if they're, for example, the first couple of guys and guy to guy were so excited, we were like, welcome, and they were like, thanks. And they were getting an error message, and they didn't know that that wasn't supposed to happen, so nobody told us. But if we had been like a teen and been like, thanks, right, that was a glitch that we didn't pick up because we're not teens and we didn't interact with the program in that way. But trying to break the program and interact with the program as much as possible so that we can identify glitches before we get there, before we get to the RCT, is really important. Another experience we had, so in addition to going through the content, we also were matched with buddies. So in the research team, we were paired. And I did this actually. I sent a really long text to my buddy, and it was over 160 characters. And so the system thought that it was able to see the first message, but then the second message it thought it was a message for G2 Genie. And so it kept throwing an error back at me. So I kept sending it, and I didn't understand what was happening. And so my buddy, he didn't block me, he just snoozed the program. But because it was just a really unpleasant experience for him and for me. And so we were able to figure out what was going on. And also we learned that error messages were vague, because if we don't understand what the error message is, then participants aren't going to either. So just a lot you can learn with an internal test. So if you can, don't skip it. And then again, the pilot. Do it, because you'll learn even more about how your program needs to be improved. So here's some feedback that we got from the pilot. So this is sort of back to the earlier question about how we evaluate our pilot. It's really, again, more process and the feedback that we're getting. So we did get positive feedback from the pilot. And so one 15-year-old teen said, I like how the messages are written. They're not too personal or lecturing. Seems one-on-one. It doesn't seem like a computer sometimes. It seems like it could be an actual person. So again, I think this is an example of how young people can form a relationship with what is an automated system. We saw this in the focus groups as well. The questions, I mean, we've decided what the questions are, well before the focus group, and even some of the probes and the follow-ups we've already pre-decided. But because young people are experiencing it over time experientially, they feel like there's actually somebody there, that there's less automation and more personalization than there actually is, which is a good thing. And another teen said, I love the text buddy. It's nice to have someone to talk to when you're bored, in need of advice, or when you just want to talk to a friend. And then feedback from the sexually inexperienced youth suggested we had to further refine messages to contextualize condoms again. So even after all of this formative work, we're still learning and getting feedback during the pilot that is incredibly helpful. Yeah?
So what happens when they learn that there's no one behind the curtain?
It's interesting. So the question is, what happens when they learn that there's nobody behind the curtain? So I don't remember this in Guy to Guy, but in Girl to Girl, watching the buddies sort of come to terms with that is really interesting. One teen will say, I thought it was a real person who was responding, every day to every message for the first 3 days, and the other buddy's like, oh, really? You didn't know? So they don't seem to feel. It's not like we haven't gotten the sense of betrayal.
No, but does that get onto the ethics question?
So the follow-up question was whether or not, sort of ethically, are we not being as honest as we sort of ethically need to be? I think it's an interesting question that I'm sure as I let it bounce around in my head for the next few days, I'll have more thoughts about. But my initial reaction would be that if part of from my perspective, what is so compelling about this text messaging delivery for teens is that this is their preferred mode of communication and it feels very personal to them. And so if giving the program a name increases that sense of personalization and allows them to engage in the program more, and therefore potentially finding the program content more salient, therefore potentially increasing behavior change, then I'm okay. I mean, we don't say there's a person behind the screen. They just sort of assume.
Correct, but it's that funny line between anonymity and comfort, which you're walking.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah.
with it, but it's like, but it's sort of, that's part of it. The other is, is it anonymous for me to pick up a book and read, the law which I want on it? That's another thing. If I give my book or my diary a name, it's got a different example. But I was just wondering on how that works.
Yeah.
I could just see someone being quite hurt about it, especially if that is their social contact.
Right. So the point is that it's a very fine line, and that there's the possibility of somebody being very hurt. And to date, we haven't gotten that feedback, but I think you're right. That doesn't mean that tomorrow we couldn't hear that.
Michele,
yes.
you have like 5 to 10 minutes.
Oh my gosh, this is great, because I was worried.
You are in the process.
Well, this is what happens. So I'm like, oh my God, I don't have enough slides. This is really good. So Claude just told me I have 5 minutes, and so this is.
You can actually go to 10. It just reduces the questions, which is fine.
Yeah.
So I think
No.
everybody wants to hear from you. I'm getting actually text while you're talking.
Oh, good. Well, no, I mean, so here's where we are in the presentation. We're moving into the RCT, and then I've got examples of lessons learned from other projects that are less detailed and more just like, oh yeah, this is what we learned. So I mean, let's just live it through. Why don't you flag me down in 5 minutes, and we'll see where we are. Oh, right, and this is really cool. So in addition to all this stuff that you learn and are able to then integrate back into your intervention, you can use all this formative work as a way to refine your recruitment strategy, which is incredibly helpful because we just sort of assume that, if we post, they'll come, and that doesn't always happen. So figuring out, especially if it's a difficult to reach population, figuring out how you're going to reach them before you have to pilot your RCT is incredibly, incredibly helpful. This is a really overwhelming slide that talks about our recruitment. So you start over here on the top left. So we post advertisements on Facebook, and then the person who's interested clicks on the ad, goes to the online screener. We include a brief explanation of what the program is about, and then have them complete the online screener. And then the screeners are sent to the study manager, who determines, based upon their answers, whether or not they're eligible or not. Then we reach out to those who are eligible. We talk on the phone, and in addition to making sure that they're eligible, we do obviously an assent, consent. We also include the capacity to consent, so it's 3 or 4 questions. So we talk, we go through the entire assent and risks and benefits and how you drop out of the program if you don't want to be in the program. And then we ask 3 to 4 questions about what we just talked about to make sure that they were listening and understood. And we also created a self-safety assessment for Guy to Guy that we now use in all of our work because we get a waiver of parental permission. This is a really vulnerable population, and if they had to get parental permission and they're not out, that could put them in danger. But at the same time, if they don't understand what it means to be getting 5 to 10 messages a day and their phone's blowing up and their parents are like, what's going on over there? That could also be a potentially dangerous situation. So we have created an assessment where we literally walk them through and we're like, okay, so let's, we've talked about a lot of stuff, but just want to, literally I think we say our aim here is to promote health and not put people in danger, so we just want to talk about this. And so we ask about what their relationship is with their parents and whether or not their parents know they're out, and if they don't, then what would it be like if they found out that they were in this program, and what about their partners, and what about their friends, what about their siblings? And then we get to brass tacks. Do you know how to password protect your phone? Does anybody else have access to your phone? Do your parents monitor your phone? Does your partner monitor your phone? And there are apps that people can download to your phone to monitor your text messages. Do you know how to look and see if there's an app? And if they say no, then we say, great, we have guides. We can send you a guide if you want. And it doesn't happen often, but I think if it never happened, I'd be uncomfortable. It does happen sometimes where we say, either the participant says, or we say, based upon what we're talking about, it doesn't sound like this is a safe situation. So being able to pass this safety assessment is a very explicit eligibility criteria. And then we send a verification text to the participant. This is a little bit old school. Back in the day, not all, especially the smaller carriers, weren't compatible with they're called aggregation, SMS aggregation. So basically the company that you create your content, and then your content is being sent to participants through this SMS service, right? So the SMS service back in the day wasn't always compatible with the smaller phone folks, so we had to send a verification to make sure that they actually could receive our messages. Now it's more just to sort of start the conversation via text, but that's why we do that. And then they do the baseline. We send them the survey, and we ask them to do the survey basically in the next day. Once they've done the survey, we then randomize them, and those who are randomized to the intervention are then given the code of conduct, and they have to agree to the code of conduct before they move on. And so here's an example, and so this is what an example Facebook advertisement looks like. It says, we need gay and bi teen guys to take part in a text messaging-based healthy sexuality program. And then there's a hopefully compelling photo. The photo really matters. I think it matters for everybody, but especially matters for teens. It's really the photo that's going to pull them in. Here, this says, be a part of research. Visit our site to find out more. We have also found that things like have your voice be heard. We want to hear from you, right? Because teens, particularly sexual and gender minority teens, don't often feel like they have a voice, and so giving them an opportunity to here's a place where we want to hear from you, we find to be very compelling, and they click on it. So I also will say that a planful recruitment is a diverse recruitment, and I am not showing you our recruitment grid because it's really overwhelming, but we actually do it. We have cells, we have recruitment goals, and we do it by sexual experience and age and ethnicity, and rural-urban status. So, for example, there's a certain number of girls that we are trying to recruit who are African American, Black, Hispanic, rural, sexually experienced between the ages of 14 and 16. That's how intense. And then they're randomized to either arm, but that's how we end up with percentages that mirror the general population. We actually try to over-recruit for racial and ethnic minority, but so then you have non-white race and Hispanic ethnicity that looks good. And then, so this sexual experience, you're seeing about a third have had receptive and a third have had insertive anal sex, and just over 1 in 10 have had vaginal sex. So again, sample was purposefully diverse in terms of the experiences that they had and did not have with sex. Okay, so this goes into other projects, sort of how we got to the recipe that we got to. So I can just leave these as they are. Yeah, why don't we do this? So, I'm happy to share the slides is the word I'm looking for. We'll just, I love this one. CiPHR is fabulous. So, I'll just stop here. So, for CiPHR we had basically, and this goes back to theory, I can't tell you what theory, but there's a theory that says if you have, not a moderator, but now I'm losing words left and right, but if you have sort of a respected other, and they're sort of the guide sharing all this information, that's a good thing. So Senga is traditionally in Uganda the paternal aunt, and it's her role to sort of teach young women how to be good wives, basically, which includes how to have sex. And so we decided to harness that, and so we created Cyber Senga, and the Senga is somebody who's sort of, older but not too old and could potentially be your Senga. And then the Koja, which it plays a similar but less culturally salient role for the boys, so then we also had a Koja. So you have the Senga and the Koja, and then you have two teenagers who are just trying to sort of figure it out. And so here is a non-bandwidth intensive way that we're doing some, we're trying to show sort of what happens. This is about problem solving, and so Eunice is her name. Eunice finds herself pregnant, and we go through various different scenarios so that the teens can sort of live through these scenarios and understand what's going to happen. And so Moses is his name. Moses says, pregnancy is your problem, not mine. And Eunice says, no, if I were impregnated, it would be a problem for both of us. And so the idea is to try and work, counter some of these cultural norms through this. And so, anyways, that's exciting. Okay. La, la, la. Okay. So this is just a conclusion, and I'll go through this relatively quickly. Again, technology-based interventions combine the wide reach of mass media with the individual tailored approach. So it's in many ways, it's sort of the best of both worlds, but it's not a panacea, and it shouldn't be seen as the go-to for all prevention and intervention efforts and all populations. So really understanding the when, why, and how to use technology, I think, is integral for our public health efforts. And I will say that with each intervention development, we learn new things. So that while those are the steps we go through, we never feel like, oh, because we've done it 5 times for 5 interventions, we don't have to do it for this intervention. So we just did Girl to Girl, we just developed Girl to Girl, which is a pregnancy prevention program for sexual minority girls. And we learned so much, and it's so very different. And we are in the process of finalizing an intervention for young adults 18 to 22, I think, in Uganda, and went through these same steps. We're in the process. We're going to be launching the pilot in a couple of weeks, and we learned so much. So I think there are some universal things, right? That tone matters, and talking to your population matters, but you can't skip the steps, because each population and each behavior target is different. So for international work, test out the technology, not just the content, but I would say that's true for domestic work as well. It's just when you're working internationally, things like network. So right now we're doing the internal test in Uganda, and 10% of the text messages that they're sending back to us are getting lost, and we're not sure if that's the network or our gateway, or whatever it is. And of course, when we were doing the internet-based intervention, we had to design it for a slower bandwidth than here. So there's just an added layer when you're doing international work. And I would just plan on iterating. That's the name of the game. I think that's it. Yeah. Oh, and yeah. So acknowledgements for funding and teams, and everybody's amazing.